Another prosperous year in the Federal Republic of Germany. We're under Chancellor Angela Merkel. What do we think is going to have in store for us this decade? What do we think life is going to throw at us, 5th of January, we've got the Olympics. On the 6th, we've got a joint Germano-Austrian ski game. Such a pleasant start to the year. And then on the 24th of January, a guy goes and shoots his whole family. And just 3 days later, a pandemic starts. Oh, we're having a great year. When you think Germany, you think of pretzels. Warm pretzels, you think of cheese, you think of bread. So much bread, my God. How do you even have 1,000 varieties of bread? Never mind. You never think of political instability. You think of prosperity. You think of quality products. You think of Nazis. And you think of beautiful architecture. But there is political turmoil in Germany. There are changing times. I'm sure many of you have heard of the AfD, der Alternative für Deutschland. Don't kill me in the comments. My pronunciation must be horrible. But the political scene is ever shifting in Germany, and in the fire rises, this is no different. Previously fringe political parties like the AfD and Die Linke are becoming increasingly popular options as the Syrian migrant crisis continues to affect Germany, all while a pandemic is hitting the country. It makes for a very bad mix-up of just complacent governance, really. The CDU and the SPD just aren't doing enough in the eyes of the people, and change is necessary. Demonstrations are getting ever more common, both from the far left and the far right. And it's only a matter of time before the 2021 elections ultimately vindicates this changing opinion. In what was definitely a surprising result for most political analysts, the AfD pulled away with roughly 23% of the vote, making it the single largest party in the electorate as the CDU and SPD had fell heavily amid not being able to deal with COVID and the oil crisis in an effective manner. Die Linke, however, had raised very quickly to 21% of the national vote, with many of their votes being taken from the SPD. This brings the AfD to be the head of the chancellery this time around. But just how do you form a coalition without a majority support? Political polarization is essentially when you have two political axes that are entirely irreconcilable and will not work together, be that left, right, or some other dividing factor. Political polarization is extremely dangerous for democratic nations, especially in times of crisis, because it paralyzes the legislature, and nothing can get done. And that's exactly what happened to the AfD government. They had to form a minority government, coalescing with the CDU, but nobody else wanted to work with the CDU and the AfD based on principles. Now, this became a major problem for the AfD. If you don't have allies in the electorate, and you don't have any compromises you're willing to make, how can you ever pass the necessary reforms you need to? You have to compromise, and it may make you unpopular, but doing nothing only makes your opposition more popular. The unholy answer to this question was in the open the whole time. They just never wanted to take it. An alliance between the far left and the far right parties seemed like an impossibility, but both Die Linke and the AfD are beset by a similar issue. Were they ever to be elected, no one is ever going to be willing to work with them. Die Linke are quite literally communists, successors of East Germany, and AfD are too far right for the tastes of any of the other parties. The only solution? They have acquired enough vote to form a government together. So, they do so, and begin pushing through reforms late, but they finally have compromised and come to a conclusion on how to deal with the oil crisis once and for all. Nuclear energy has been something Germany has had for years, but the Green Party, as a condition of coalescing with the CDU and SPD in the past, had demanded that it be removed. The phase-out was slowed down by the CDU, but it was not stopped. Amid the oil crisis, reactivating nuclear power plants was necessary. Die Linke and the AfD were able to unite on this issue, and in doing so, they combined to form a powerful political bloc, if even just for now. The sluggish time that it took for this legislation to be pushed through led to the AfD losing some popularity in the electorate. In 2025, Die Linke would wind up winning, but the coalition would be maintained, with Die Linke being the senior partner this time around, while the AfD remained a subsidiary. This coalition would lead all the way through 2025, into 2026, and into a time of crisis. Susan Wagenknecht had used her connections with the communists in Russia to try and help alleviate the oil crisis, removing sanctions to improve relations utilizing oligarchic connections, and likewise bringing Soviet economic aid to Germany. But the Soviets were not interested in working with Germany if it meant that Germany was going to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, and ultimately NATO had guaranteed to do so. And the Soviet Union was not about to accept that. Wagenknecht took her loyal deputies and split off from Die Linke, which threw Germany into another political crisis, all while Russia was invading Ukraine. What does this mean? Germany is in another time of economic and governmental turmoil, as they heavily relied on Russian energy for energy security. That means this war needs to end quickly. The only way to ensure that it can end quickly is to get as involved as we can. NATO guarantees on Ukraine are honored by this government, and we will use everything in our power to ensure that the Soviets are thrown back into their country. As we saw Soviet forces invading Ukraine, we also noticed high concentrations along the NATO border, especially along Poland and the Baltic. We knew what this meant. They weren't going to stop at Ukraine, they were going to go past and into Europe. Without the United States watching over us as its custodian, the Soviets knew we were unprepared. And they were right. Our forces were modernized and expanded, but they were not up to snuff. We had 2 full armies of heavy mechanized on the border, ready to deploy and move in, and they did. We saw initial successes moving into Belarus, but they were only initial successes. All we could do was prepare a defense operation while we figured out what to do next. As Soviet forces penetrated deeper into Ukraine, they overextended themselves a bit as they got used to probing the NATO lines. They allowed us to sink a little deeper just to see our capabilities, and ultimately, with the front lines solidified, they began to push back in places. It became clear that where our forces weren't, the line was going to fall. Holding the center was a good bet, but as the north began to fall and the south began to fall, we could very quickly see that a pincer would happen if we didn't readjust ourselves. The regrettable loss of the Baltic was supplemented by us thankfully stabilizing the line in the north. The Soviets nearly secured a breakthrough into Königsberg once again. That would have led them into the northern Polish plains, and from there, if we had let them go wild, the war would have been over. It was at this point NATO command approved the first counteroffensive of the war, which did not go very well. Germany was the only nation really trying to push, while the rest were not doing a good job, throwing themselves into heavily fortified positions or not advancing at all. Of no help to the war effort, we wound up relegating ourselves to being the anchor force of NATO for the entire war. After the Memel line fractured and the Soviets were beginning to threaten Königsberg, it was decided to pull back behind the Vistula in the north to defend Danzig. Keeping the Polish ports open for supply traffic was absolutely paramount to the war effort, so we had to hold the Polish coastline if we could, and defend Warsaw at the same time. We successfully counterattacked back into Prussia, which was great. We were finally making progress against the Soviets. We had done nothing but lose for weeks, months prior to this. Thankfully, this was signs that the Soviet military was weakening. Perhaps we had a chance after all. For the most part, we had stabilized the northern half of the front. Although Romania was falling, this was a good sign. We could continue to drain Russian forces like this, but casualties were not looking in our favor. It was at this point that I realized Hungary was falling. If they fell, Czechia would be next, and my heartland would be wide open. The German heartland could not come under threat. We were the industrial center of Europe, its military backbone in this war. If it came under threat, surrender was imminent. We had to retreat behind the Vistula once again. There was just no choice in it. With our forces divided between the northern front and Hungary, there was just nothing that could be done about it. While we had successfully defended Budapest from Soviet incursion, Poland was falling rapidly. At this point, the morale of the Bundeswehr was soaring, but NATO's overall morale had fallen greatly. With the total loss of Romania, the loss of Budapest briefly, and the near loss of Krakow in the ongoing battle, it was very much clear that NATO was on the back foot. While we were holding a defensive posture, one that we ourselves were willing to hold, much of NATO was disinterested in continuing the war. The East was tired, and they felt betrayed that we would abandon them. But we were doing our best. Drafting up yet another defensive line. It was looking like this might be our last defensive line. If we lost Warsaw and Budapest, we were going to surrender. It seemed almost guaranteed. So, we decided to hold right at the river, to do our very best to hold the territory that we still clung on to. Even though we had but 2 full armies, we were still able to hold wherever we were. So, it was our duty to be the Iron Wall. Definitively on the back foot, it was decided by the German High Command that if NATO would not approve another offensive, Germany would. Germany began to push into northern Poland to retake Prussia from the Soviets. And we met good success, but our allies could not keep up. Despite great successes in the northern coastal offensive, we had ran out of ammunition due to our inadequate military industry. We had to pull back to rearm, but we would be back on the front. Hopefully our allies could hold in the meantime. The front line totally collapsed in our absence. We returned to chaos, but we were able to exploit it. The Soviet forces had overextended again into Poland, and we were able to push back, but we had lost Hungary for good this time. Despite all our efforts, the combined forces of NATO just couldn't do it. They just could not hold. We were pushed out of Poland, out of Poznan, and back into our own territories. We had surrendered. Economic chaos was upon us. We had spent everything. We had risked resource and energy in security just to avoid trading with the Russians, to defend Ukraine. And what did we have to show for it at the end? But ruin and hundreds of thousands of dead.
This must be the last time Germany takes defeat!
The Dritte Weg, or the Third Way in English, is a German neo-Nazi organization. You might call it a neo-Nazi organization, but in actuality, if you break it down, it is a neo-Strasserist organization. A slight dive into what Strasserism is will show you the very little difference that there is. During Weimar Republic Germany, before Hitler was in the NSDAP, there were the Strasser brothers and some other names, but the Strasser brothers are the only ones that are important. Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser were the ideologues of Strasserism. The whole idea behind Strasserism is essentially taking elements of leftist politics and right-wing politics and combining them together to form a national communism of sorts. Now, of course, this ideology and its adherents were purged in the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, where the Sturmabteilung, as well as Gregor Strasser himself, were removed from the equation. Otto Strasser would spend time in exile in Prague and, after the Munich Conference, in Canada. Now, how does this relate to the current situation? Well, glad you asked. Strasserism being a combination of the left and the right, as Strasser puts it, communism without internationalism, and nationalism without capitalism. It is, essentially, a combination of the left and right, and if you remember, Die Linke and AfD coalesced earlier in the video. This has normalized the left and right-wing extremes working together. And in this time of strife, in this time of anger, where the people of the left and the right have looked at one another as one for so long already, it's not too much of a jump to say that Dritte Weg would get popularity from this, and use it to take the reins of state in a coup. Elements of the Bundeswehr gathered around Berlin under direction of dissatisfied generals. Extremist parties had been in contact with parts of the military, and it was now time to make that move. With the government vulnerable after the assassination of the president, it was time to go ahead and storm the Reichstag. With the Reichstag under control, it was now the goal of the extremist parties to dole out who would be the leader among them. Of course, you had Die Heimat, formerly the NPD, but you also had, of course, Dritte Weg. Dritte Weg had by far more popular support at this point, so they were the shoe-in. Klaus Armstrong would take the chancellery into his hands and immediately begin centralizing power, implementing the Dritte Weg's 10-point program, and going forward with centralizing state power, rapidly militarizing the economy, and rapidly deflating the currency, as it was currently at over 300% inflation. When Chancellor Armstrong ascended to supreme office, Bavaria and the CSU broke away with Austrian support. It didn't take long for our military to gather together and take them down. The combined forces of the Bavarian loyalists and the Austrian forces were not enough to stop the German army. No surprise to anyone. With the situation at home stabilized, we could begin helping out our would-be allies that were bogged down in civil wars. refounding the Condor Legion and sending them to Spain. With Spain secured and Greece soon to follow, it was time to invade the Nordic nations that were not going to join us willingly, but we could force them to. Their vital resources would be absolutely necessary in the upcoming war, and allowing them to fall into Soviet hands just wasn't an option. It was a pragmatic decision to ally with all of the new governments that had taken over. The UK, Belgium, France, Italy, Spain. Even though Spain was our only ideological equal, Italy was a monarchy. France was under Villars, a dictatorship, one that was loyal to the Republic. Belgium, an absolute monarchy, and the United Kingdom as well. We had an alliance full of monarchs, and we ourselves were National Socialists. We would not stick with them forever, and they would definitely not stick with us forever. This was purely pragmatic.
For the glory of the Reich! The order of the Führer is our success!
Deutschland! In uns! Und wir Deutschland! Und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
We may have triumphed over the Bolshevik horde, but we have yet to triumph over our former defeaters. France still holds Alsace-Lorraine. France still holds Germans. The Belgians rule over the Dutch, our brothers, and the Italians still hold South Tyrol. This can't be allowed to stand. Not when they are not even ideologically aligned with us. If we leave Marshal Villars in France, he's going to establish a republic. If we leave King Charles in the UK, he'll just go back to the old system. And the new king in Italy, he's not going to be any different. And we know they're going to betray us anyway. We have to remove them from the equation. And it's such a shame, too. They were such good fodder against the Soviets. We begin with a classic move, one enhanced by modern doctrines and the mobility of mechanized infantry. That being, going around the lowlands to get into France. Do we need to? No, the Maginot Line is long gone, but that doesn't mean we can't do it for old time's sakes.
Das war zu einfach! Es sind du und ich, du kommunistische Marionette! Verdammt! Leg ihn auf! Alter! Schwere Mischung! For the glory of the Reich! Conquer all that stand before us! For the Führer! teammate has disappointed the Führer! You will not see him again!
Neben diesem Wagen! Oben auf dem Dach! Neben den Sandsäcken!
We honor the Führer with our success!
Schicken Sie uns einen MG-42-Trupp.
Sagen Sie dem Kommandostab, wir greifen an. Sie sollen Verstärkung schicken.
Aufteilen! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke! Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz!
Überprüfen Sie die Waffen. Wollen Sie mal keine Ladehemmungen.
Feuer öffnen! Nageln Sie fest! Weiter feuern, Männer! Wir müssen sie unten halten! Weiter feuern!
3 Männern Distanze. Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz.
Gehen Sie in Abwehrstellung! Wir wissen, wie viele es sind!
Schicken Sie uns einen MG-42-Trupp.
Sagen Sie dem Kommandostab, wir greifen an! Sie sollen Verstärkung schicken!
Panzerkommando und 106. Gibt es Tiegeralarm? Da beißt die Druckangriffe. Ist da jemand? Hallo? Ende. Wir schicken eine Patrouille zur Verstärkung. Ende. Hoffentlich haben Sie eine gute Entschuldigung, dass Ihr Posten nicht besetzt ist.
Hello everybody, happy Sunday or whatever day it is you're watching this. I put way more work than I thought I would into this, which is why I released it a little late, but hey, I hope it was worth it to you, it was worth it to me. I got the product out on time, well, relatively, whatever. I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you're having a good day. Take care of yourself. Thanks for making it this far.